The first thing I saw that morning was a steel clamp wrapped around the front tire of my Ford, like somebody had decided my driveway needed a warning label. It was bright orange, ugly as sin, and sitting there in the Tennessee heat, like it had more right to be there than I did. For a few seconds I stood barefoot on the porch with coffee in my hand, thinking, no way. No grown adult looked at my truck, parked on my land, and thought, yeah, let us start a war before breakfast. I lived in a subdivision called Laurel Bend, outside Knoxville, the kind of place where neighbors could tell you who left their trash cans out past noon. My place sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, and beside my driveway there was a gravel apron my grandfather had laid down years ago. He parked his bass boat there. My dad parked his work van there, and after my divorce, when I moved back in with 2 suitcases and a credit score that looked like a crime scene, I parked my truck there too. It was mine in the boring legal way that matters when people start acting stupid. Deed description, parcel line, survey markers, taxes paid every December. But apparently that orange clamp had not gotten the memo. There was a laminated notice zip tied to the rim, and across the top it said, Authorized Parking Enforcement Action, Removal Fee 300 PSD. I laughed once, just a dry little sound, because some nonsense is so bold it almost deserves applause. Then I saw the name at the bottom, Sentinel Property Compliance, authorized by Laurel Bend Residential Council, and that laugh died right in my throat. His name was Bryce Callahan, and Bryce was one of those men who did not become a cop. So he built himself a smaller kingdom where nobody could tell him he was not one. He drove a gray Tahoe with amber lights on top, wore tactical boots, and carried a black clipboard like it was a badge. Before Sentinel, Laurel Bend had been annoying in the normal suburban way. Emails about shutter colors, grass height, mailbox paint, all that petty nonsense people dress up as community standards. But after Bryce showed up, warning stickers started appearing on windshields and folks began peeking through blinds before taking out the trash. Somehow, from the first week, Bryce decided I was a problem. Maybe because my truck had dents and mud on it. Maybe because I did not bow my head when he used words like compliance. Or maybe because when he came to my door in March and told me the gravel beside my driveway was considered shared access frontage, I looked him dead in the face and said, shared by who? Me and the squirrels? He did not laugh. He checked his clipboard and said, the council recognizes that area as visible community frontage. I said, the county recognizes it as my property, and the county is the one I write checks to. He gave me that little dead-eyed smile and said, we review your file. That was the beginning of it. After that, I caught him rolling past my house slow enough to count weeds. My neighbor, Ruthie Alvarez, a widow with purple reading glasses and the most dangerous gossip network in East Tennessee, told me she heard Bryce say at a council meeting that certain residents were testing the limits of enforcement. Certain residents. That was how cowards point without using a finger. So when I saw that clamp on my truck, I did not think mistake. My stomach dropped because I understood. This was not parking enforcement. This was a message. I called the number on the notice and got a woman who sounded like she had already decided I was wasting her morning. She asked for the violation code. I read it to her. Keys clicked. Then she said, you can settle the removal fee with a debit or credit card. I said, Mom, I am not settling anything. Your company immobilized a vehicle on private land. There was a pause. Then she said, Sir, Laurel Bend authorizes enforcement for all front-facing access zones. That phrase hit me like a magic trick because it sounded official. It sounded expensive, and it meant absolutely nothing. I looked at my truck, at that orange clamp gripping my tire like a cheap threat, and something in me went very still. Not hot anger, not yelling anger. The quiet kind you get after somebody underestimates you one time too many. I said, all right. Then I hung up. Ruthie was across the street pretending to water the same hydrangea, and when she saw me looking, she lifted one hand like she had just watched a funeral. I walked inside and stood there listening to the old refrigerator hum. I had spent the last year rebuilding my life after a marriage that ended in lawyers, boxes, a Kate, and silence that makes a house feel twice as big. Maybe that is why the clamp bothered me so much. It was not just metal on a tire. It was the assumption behind it. Pay up, shut up, move on. Most people do. But that morning, with my truck locked up 10 feet from the porch my grandfather built, I decided Bryce Callahan had picked the wrong tired man. So I pulled down a plastic storage bin full of old house documents, and at the bottom, folded inside a yellow envelope with my dad's handwriting on it. I found the original boundary survey from 1992. I spread it out on the kitchen table, and there it was, clear as daylight. The council easement ended before the gravel apron even began, 6.5 feet short, 6.5 feet between their authority and my truck. I sat there looking at that line for a long time, and for the first time, all morning, I smiled. That smile did not last long, because the longer I looked at that survey, the more the whole thing started to feel less like a misunderstanding and more like somebody had been waiting for a chance. 6.5 feet is not a rounding error. It is not a gray area. It is not one of those property line mysteries where two old men argue over a fence post for 20 years. It was right there in black ink. The neighborhood easement stopped, my gravel began, and Bryce Callahan had clamped my truck anyway, so I did what angry men are not supposed to do. I slowed down. I made another cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and started building a folder called Sentinel. Pictures first, close-ups of the clamp, the tag, the tire, the gravel, the mailbox, the edge of the street, then wider shots showing exactly where the truck sat. I took measurements from the asphalt to the old iron marker near the dogwood tree, wrote the numbers on painter's tape, stuck it to the ground, took more pictures. Ruthie watched from her porch for a while, then finally came over with a mason jar of lemonade and said, "Jonah, honey, either you are about to sue somebody or bury somebody." I said, "Depends how polite they get." She laughed, but not all the way, because she knew the look on my face was not joking. Then she told me something that changed the temperature of the whole day. She said Bryce had not just been bothering me. He had fined Mr. Hamley 2 streets over because his daughter parked her hospice nurse's car in front of the house overnight. He had put a warning sticker on a single mother's minivan because one tire touched the grass while she unloaded groceries in the rain. He had threatened to tow a contractor's trailer even though the owner had written approval from the council. And when the man showed Bryce the email, Bryce supposedly said, "Approval can be reviewed after enforcement." That sentence stuck in my head because it was the whole disease in 5 words. Punish first, explain later. Make people feel small. Make the fee cheaper than the fight. Then call it order. By noon, I had printed the survey, my deed description, tax records, and a screenshot from the county property map. And by 1:30, I was sitting in the Blount County Land Records office under fluorescent lights that made everybody look guilty. The woman behind the counter was named Carol Meeks, and she had the kind of tired eyes you only get from spending 30 years watching people discover property law after they are already furious. I laid out the paperwork and explained it as calmly as I could. She slid her glasses down, looked at the survey, looked at the photos, then said, "They put the device here?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She tapped the gravel apron with one fingernail and said, "That is not council frontage." Then she leaned back and gave me a look that was not surprise. Exactly. More like confirmation of something she'd been expecting. I asked if Sentinel had been in there before. She said, "I cannot gossip in an official capacity." Then she paused, printed 2 pages, stamped them, and said, "But I can give you a certified parcel boundary verification, and I strongly suggest you keep notes of every contact from this point on." It is funny how a sentence like that can calm you down and scare you at the same time. On the drive home, I kept thinking about my grandfather, about how he used to say land is just dirt until somebody tries to take a piece of it. Then it becomes your spine. I never understood that when I was younger. I understood it that afternoon. When I got back, Bryce was parked across from my house in that grey Tahoe, engine running, one elbow out the window, sunglasses, and even though a storm was rolling in, he watched me carry the folder up the driveway like he was waiting for me to perform fear. I set the papers on the hood of my wife's old garden cart, walked over, and said, "You here to remove the clamp?" He smiled without showing teeth. "You ready to resolve the violation?" I said, "I just did." "County says you have no authority here." His jaw twitched, just a little, but enough. He said, "The council disagrees." I said, "The council can disagree with gravity if it wants, Bryce, that my truck will still be on my land." For a second, neither of us moved. The wind had picked up, and the laminated tag on my tire kept slapping against the rim like a little plastic metronome. Then he said, "You know, people move into communities like this and think they can do whatever they want because they own a patch of ground." I said, "That is usually what owning a patch of ground means." His smile disappeared. "No," he said, "it means you agreed to live by standards I looked past him at the neat lawns, the matching mailboxes, the silent windows with curtains barely moving, and I understood the ugly little truth. Bryce did not care about my truck. He cared that I had refused to let him define the world out loud and have everyone accept it. Men like Bryce need witnesses. They need people to see them win. So I said, "You are trespassing every minute that device stays on my vehicle, and every minute gives me a cleaner timeline." He leaned forward out the window and lowered his voice. "You keep pushing, Jonah, and this becomes a lot more expensive for you than a removal fee." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly dumb. I said, "Bryce, I've been divorced in Tennessee. You are going to have to do better than expensive." His eyes went flat. Then he rolled up the window and drove off slow, like the street belonged to him. That night, I wrote the letter. Not a rant, not a threat, not one of those emotional emails people regret after midnight, but a clean, ugly, surgical demand letter. I identified the vehicle, the location, the parcel number, the boundary verification, the time the clamp was attached, the removal fee demand, and the ongoing daily penalty they claimed they could charge. I requested immediate removal, reimbursement of costs, written acknowledgement that Sentinel had no enforcement authority on that gravel apron, and preservation of all photographs, dispatch notes, call logs, emails, and council communications related to my address. Then I sent it to Sentinel, to every member of the Laurel Bend Council, to their management company, and because Ruthie had given me names with the precision of a woman who should have worked intelligence, I copied 3 neighbors who had already been hit with questionable fines. I hit send at 11:47 p.m., and for the first time since morning, the house felt quiet in a way that did not feel lonely. The next day my phone started ringing at 803. The first call was from Sentinel's office manager, who said my email had been received and was under review. I said, "The clamp is still on my truck." She said, "We are evaluating jurisdictional materials." I said, "Evaluate faster." 10 minutes later, Dale Mercer called, president of the Laurel Bend Council, a man who sold insurance, more quarter zips in July, and spoke in the soft, panic voice of somebody who had suddenly realized his volunteer position came with actual consequences. Dale said, "Jonah, I think this thing may have gotten a little out of hand." I said, "Dale, my truck is immobilized on my property. That is not out of hand. That is in writing." He cleared his throat and started using phrases like good faith enforcement, evolving interpretation, neighborly resolution, which is how people talk when they are trying to bury the word liability under a pile of couch pillows. I told him I wanted the clamp removed and the record corrected. He said, "We do not want to set a precedent." That one got me. I said, "Dale, the precedent you are worried about is people finding out where your authority ends." He went quiet. Then he said, "Let me talk to our attorney." By lunchtime, the neighborhood had turned into a whisper factory. Ruthie called twice. "Mr. Term." Hanley came by with a folder of his own, hands shaking from anger or age, maybe both, and showed me the hospice nurse ticket. A woman named Marissa from Creekview Lane sent me photos of a warning sticker Bryce had slapped on a minivan while her kid was having an asthma attack inside. I had never been the guy people came to with neighborhood problems. Honestly, I had spent most of that year trying to avoid everyone, but one by one they came, not because I was special, but because I had done the one thing they had all wanted to do and had been too tired to start. That evening I printed everything, stacked it in order, and made a timeline so detailed it would have bored a judge into believing me. Friday morning, I filed a civil claim in county court for unlawful immobilization, trespass to property, costs, and damages. The clerk flipped through the packet, stopped at the certified boundary verification, looked at the photos, then looked up at me and said, "You brought receipts." I said, "Mom, receipts are my love language." She stamped the papers, and that sound, that heavy, flat smack of the stamp, felt better than it probably should have. By the time I got home, there was an email from Dale waiting in my inbox. Emergency Laurel Bend Council meeting, Monday evening, enforcement contract review. I stared at that subject line for a long moment while rain tapped against the kitchen window, and outside, that orange clamp still sat on my tire, bright, stupid, and suddenly looking less like a threat than evidence. By Sunday afternoon, that orange clamp had become the most famous object in Laurel Bend. People slowed down when they drove past my house. Kids pointed at it from the back seats of minivans. A man I had never spoken to in my life walked by with a golden retriever and gave me a quiet thumbs up, like I was holding some kind of neighborhood hostage flag. And the funny thing was, the longer Sentinel left it there, the worse it looked for them. That clamp had been meant to embarrass me, to make me look like the guy who could not follow the rules. But by the third day, it looked less like punishment and more like proof. Monday evening, while the council was holding their emergency meeting at the little clubhouse by the pool, Ruthie called me and said, "You did not hear this from me, but you may want to keep your phone nearby tonight." I asked why. She said, "Because stupid people are about to talk in a room full of nervous people." I did not ask how she knew that, because with Ruthie, you learned not to question the source, only the accuracy, and the accuracy was usually terrifying. Around 9. A voice recording started moving through the neighborhood group chat like wildfire. Somebody had left a phone running in a tote bag during the meeting, and I know that sounds dramatic, but Laurel Bend had always been one casserole away from espionage. The audio was messy, chairs scraping, papers shuffling, Dale Mercer clearing his throat every 10 seconds. But the important parts were clear enough. One council member asked why Sentinel had enforced on a parcel confirmed as private property. Another asked if they could be personally liable. Then Bryce spoke, and the whole room changed. He did not sound sorry. He sounded insulted. He said residents had become too comfortable challenging authority. That enforcement only worked when consequences were immediate. That if the council backed down every time a homeowner waved a survey around, standards would collapse. Waved a survey around, like the legal boundary at my own property was some party trick. Then Marissa, the woman from Creekview Lane, who had apparently shown up with her asthma story in a folder of photos, asked why her minivan had been stickered during a medical emergency. Bryce said, "According to the recording, exceptions are how disorder starts." That was the moment he lost the room. You could hear it, not in shouting, but in silence. The kind of silence that happens when people finally realize the man they hired to protect rules does not actually understand people. Dale tried to calm things down, but by then the neighbors were angry. And not internet angry, not comment section angry, real angry. The kind built from months of swallowing little humiliations because you had dinner to cook and bills to pay and did not have the energy to fight a clipboard. The next morning, the clamp was gone. No knock, no apology, no call. I walked outside in gym shorts with my coffee, ready to look at that ugly thing again. And the gravel apron was empty, except for 4 clean marks where it had sat against the tire. For a second, I just stood there, confused by the absence of something I hated. Then I saw an envelope tucked under the wiper blade. It was from Sentinel, printed on stiff letterhead, saying enforcement action had been rescinded pending further jurisdictional review. I read that sentence twice and laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee on myself. Further jurisdictional review was a very expensive way of saying, we found out Jonah was right, but I did not drop the claim. That surprised some people. Dale called me that afternoon with that same damn, careful voice and said, "Since the device has been removed, we are hoping to move forward in a neighborly way." I said, "Dale?" Neighborly would have been asking before clamping my truck. He sighed and said, "What are you looking for?" I told him I wanted written acknowledgement, reimbursement, damages, filing costs, and a public review of every Sentinel citation issued in Laurel Bend over the past year. He said that was a lot. I said, so was putting a boot on my truck. 2 days later, Sentinel terminated Bryce. They did not say fired. Of course, companies never use the honest word when a softer one can wear a tie. The email said he was no longer assigned to Laurel Bend operations, effective immediately. Then, by Friday, the council cancelled the Sentinel contract completely. Their message to residents said they would be transitioning toward a more collaborative compliance process. Ruthie printed it, brought it to my porch, and read that line out loud in a voice so fancy she sounded like a haunted country club. We both laughed until her dog started barking. A week after that, I received a settlement offer. Sentinel agreed to reimburse the removal fee they had demanded, pay my filing costs, cover a modest amount for damages, and send a written correction to the council stating that my gravel apron was outside their enforcement authority. The total was not huge, just under $2,000. Not life-changing money, not the kind of check that makes you quit your job or buy a boat, but that was never the point. The point was walking outside the next morning, standing in the same place where I had first seen that clamp, and seeing my truck sitting peacefully on my land like it always had. No warning tank, no orange metal, no grey Tahoe crawling past the mailbox. Just cicadas, cut grass, and the old dogwood tree moving in the wind. I thought I would feel victorious, and I did. A little, but mostly I felt tired. Because the truth is, fighting people like Bryce costs you even when you win. It takes your mornings, your sleep, your patience, your trust in the idea that adults in small positions of power will use common sense, and maybe that is why most folks pay. Not because they believe the fine is right, but because peace sometimes feels cheaper than justice. About a month later, Ruthie told me Bryce had been hired by another private compliance company 2 counties over. Same boots, different neighborhood. I wish I could say I was shocked, but I was not. Men like Bryce do not disappear. They relocate. They find a new gate, a new clipboard, a new group of tired people who would rather avoid trouble than challenge it. And that is the part that still bothers me. This whole thing started with one clamp on one tire, but it was never really about parking. It was about whether a person with a little borrowed power can stand on your property, rewrite the truth in a confident voice, and count on you being too exhausted to object. So I will ask you this. If you walked outside tomorrow and found your vehicle locked up on land you knew was yours, would you pay the fee just to make the headache go away? Or would you drag the whole mess into daylight no matter how uncomfortable it got? Because some neighbors told me I did the right thing, and some said I made the community look bad. Personally, I think the community looked bad the second it let a bully carry a clipboard and call it order. But I want to know what you think. Was I stubborn, or was I right? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a property manager, or some fake little kingdom that thought nobody would push back, tell me your story, because I promise you, somebody watching needs to hear it.